What comes to mind when you think of Yu-Gi-Oh? It might be memories of watching the Yu-Gi-Oh anime on a Saturday morning or playing with friends on the playground. However, did you know that there's a thriving competitive scene for the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game? Whether you've never played competitively before or you're a seasoned veteran, this comprehensive guide to competitive Yu-Gi-Oh has something for everyone. My name is tcgsam and I've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh competitively since I was 13. I've participated in various levels of competition that Yu-Gi-Oh has to offer, and this guide will cover everything from the basics of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh to tournament winning tips and tricks I've picked up over the years. If you're looking to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh after a long hiatus, looking to attend your first tournament ever, or just seeking competitive tournament tips you won't find anywhere else, then this video is for you. So sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the video. This section is intended for those who are new to the competitive scene but already know the basic rules of the game. If you're new to the game, I'd highly recommend checking out my complete beginner's guide to the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game, which you'll find linked in the top right corner. The biggest change you'll encounter when transitioning from playing casually to competitively will likely be adhering to Yu-Gi-Oh's ban list. While you and your friends might be okay with playing with whatever cards you have access to, in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, there are a pool of banned cards that are not allowed to be played at all, or cards that are limited and semi-limited, meaning you're only allowed to be playing 1 or 2 copies respectively in your deck. This ban list essentially dictates what the most powerful decks will be in the competitive scene, since it's constantly changing every couple of months and lowering the power levels of the best and most played decks, while also giving boosts to lesser played decks to make them more competitive. There's also no rotation like with Pokemon or Magic the Gathering, so you can use cards from any era so long as you abide by the ban list. Hence, the first step to get into playing competitively will be to ensure that your deck adheres to the official Konami ban list, which you can find online on the official Yu-Gi-Oh website. This also means that you may have to change up your card choices or deck choice every few months once the ban list comes out, depending on what deck you chose to play. Once you've made sure that your deck complies with the ban list, the next step I would recommend is to try and understand what types of strategies are currently being played the most, either by watching some replays of these decks going up against each other, or by watching a deck profile that explains what each card does and what cards you can expect those decks to be playing. Having even a basic understanding of these meta strategies will make it so you're less likely to encounter a matchup where you're completely lost. While this isn't a necessity to start playing competitively, from my experience it's incredibly beneficial, because the biggest gripe I've heard from players who don't want to start playing at a competitive level is that there are too many decks out there and they don't know what's going on when they play against them. While it can be daunting to try and understand all the popular meta decks and what they're trying to do, just remember that practice makes perfect, and you shouldn't feel that you have to completely understand what every deck out there does, since this will come with the more games that you play. Once you got those two things down, that's pretty much all you need to start playing Yu-Gi-Oh at a competitive level. At the end of the day, you're still playing the same game that you were when you were playing casually, except now there are a few more things to remember. In this next section, I'll be going over what to expect at your very first tournament and the types of tournaments that are available for you to start playing in. Now that you're familiar with the basics of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, you're ready to experience the competitive side of the game by participating in tournaments. These tournaments are where you get to compete against other players while also earning prizes in the process. In this section, I'll be covering the different types of tournaments that are available for you to play in, as well as what to expect when you go to your first tournament. Let's start with what to expect at a tournament and how they work. Standard tournament rounds are played in the Swiss format, meaning that you'll play against others with a similar win-loss ratio as you have, and that you aren't eliminated no matter how many times you lose. The number of rounds you'll play is determined by the number of participants in the tournament and can range anywhere from 3 to 4 all the way to 11 or 12 in the largest tournaments out there. Official tournament matches in the trading card game are also a best 2 out of 3, where players get to use their side deck in the second and third games in a match. After finishing each round, you get 3 points for a win, 1 point for a draw, and 0 points for a loss. Note that if a round isn't finished within the time limit, the outcome will be decided by the end of match procedures, which you can find online. At the end of the Swiss rounds, the final rankings are determined by the number of points each player has, and players with the same number of points are ranked using tiebreaker scores. It's not important for you to know how tiebreaker scores work, but in a nutshell, if the players you played against performed well in the tournament, your tiebreaker score will be higher and put you ahead of others with the same score as you. Some longer tournaments may also have a playoff bracket once Swiss rounds are concluded, where the top ranked players play in a single elimination format, meaning if you lose, you're out. After the tournament concludes, prizes ranging from booster packs to Nintendo Switches are distributed to the top ranking competitors, with the value of prizes depending on the scale of the tournament. Now a few quick things about tournament etiquette. The deck you use at a tournament should be sleeved, not only to protect the cards from wear and tear, but also to prevent any forms of cheating. While it's not mandatory, I'd also highly recommend getting a playmat that you can put down onto the table to protect your cards even further. I'll talk more about where you can get sleeves and playmats at the end of the video. At the start of each match, you and your opponents will shuffle your own decks, then present it to each other for a final cut. Generally, players will also choose to roll a dice to determine who goes first or second before the match, and when the round timer starts, play can then begin. Something to note is that you should be ready to present your deck to an opponent for a cut after you go into it to add cards from your deck to your hand, and you should be prepared to do the same for your opponent's deck. Also, larger tournaments will have official judges that you can ask for help with tournament procedures or specific rulings on how certain cards will work with each other. While most opponents won't intentionally mislead you if you have a question, don't be afraid to call a judge over to ask for help if you're not sure about something, especially if it's your first time at a larger event. I know that was a lot to take in, but that's essentially how all tournaments you play in are going to work. Now let's get into the different types of tournaments out there that you can participate in, starting with the most accessible tournament, locals. Local tournaments are generally held at least once a week by official tournament scores, a list of which can be found online on the Yugioh website. Entry fees for these tournaments are usually quite low, and you'll usually get an exclusive tournament booster pack just for participating, with additional prizes for the top finishers. These local tournaments are the perfect place to get started on your competitive journey, since they're more easily accessible in your local area, last only 4 to 5 rounds, and are much lower stakes than some of the other more competitive tournaments out there. You're also more likely to encounter players who don't only use the best decks out there, meaning that you'll get more exposure to the different possible strategies that you might come across when playing the game. So overall, I'd recommend starting off with these local tournaments, and then playing in the larger tournaments I'll mention soon once you become more comfortable with the competitive scene. I won't go into too much detail about events higher than locals, since all this information can be found online, but rather I'll provide a quick summary and overview of what larger tournaments are out there. The next step up from locals, in my opinion, will be regional level events. Top finishers at a regional tournament will get invites to the invitation-only nationals event that takes place once a year in different regions across the globe. On average, regional tournaments will last about twice as long as local tournaments and have a couple hundred people in attendance. If you get an invitation to nationals, you'll find that it's a massive tournament where thousands of players from all across the region travel to, because the top few finishers there get the honor of participating in the World Championships, which is the highest level of competition out there. Nationals are even more grueling than regionals, since they have upwards of 10 to 12 rounds of Swiss with a top 64 or top 32 playoffs bracket over the course of 2 days, so it'll take a lot of endurance to make it all the way through. If you are one of the few players to make it through the field, you'll get an invitation to compete at the exclusive World Championships, which is an invite-only tournament held once per year. Worlds is the one level of tournament I've still never gotten to participate in because of its exclusivity, since you either have to perform incredibly well at the national event, or end the season with enough Worlds points by attending many official events and placing high enough. Now this is all you really need to know about the basics of what these tournaments are, and once again, you can find the full details of these tournaments online if you want to know more, so I'll move on to the next section now. In this final section, I'll be covering tournament tips and tricks that have helped me over the years. I'll start off with tips for before you even enter a tournament. First, I'd highly recommend committing to a deck early on before the tournament, just so you can get the most practice with it. While you may have heard stories of people building their decks the night before the event and performing well, these are the exceptions rather than the rule. Even if the deck you choose to play isn't necessarily the quote-unquote best deck out there, it's way more important in my opinion to be very familiar with the deck that you're playing, especially at the start of your competitive journey, since these tournaments can get very long. The more familiar you are with your own deck, the less likely you are to make mistakes throughout the course of a long tournament. This will not only alleviate the stress of playing in a high pressure environment, but also will make it so you don't need to think as much as you would have if you were playing a more unfamiliar strategy. After you've chosen a deck, I suggest testing it a lot before the event. This can be done in person by playing games with a testing group, or online using simulators like Dueling Book. Either way, you want to make sure that these testing sessions allow you to become more familiar with your own deck strategy, gain experience in different meta matchups, or allow you to test out new cards and see whether they'll fit well into your deck. Some very general tips for testing that I'll give is to prioritize quality over quantity. I believe that it's much more important to carefully analyze why you either won or lost the game in your testing, as opposed to mindlessly playing countless games whether or not you win or lose. As a bonus tip, when you're testing out new cards and seeing whether they're good to play in your deck, I suggest playing games as if you started with that card in your hand, so you can truly see how impactful it is each time. Now that you've finished deciding on a deck you want to go with and testing it out, I suggest filling out a deck list before arriving at an event that requires one. Larger tournaments like regionals and YCSs usually require you to submit a deck list like you see on the screen, either in the form of a paper copy or online through some sort of website before the tournament begins. I'd highly recommend filling this out before you arrive at the tournament, just so you're not stressing about whether or not you'll have time to fill it out before the tournament starts. Just keep in mind that once you submit a deck list, you won't be able to change it afterwards, so make sure that you're comfortable with the list you submit, and make sure there aren't any careless mistakes on it, like not writing the full name of a card. Now, moving on to the actual tournament tips themselves. As I mentioned before, larger events like regionals or YCSs are incredibly grueling and take up almost an entire day most of the time. Thus, I'd highly recommend bringing enough water and some snacks to keep you going throughout the day, since there isn't a set time for players to have a lunch break during these events. You never know if you'll be able to finish a round early enough to be able to go out and buy food in the middle, so it's better to be prepared. As you're all probably also aware from back when you were still in school, staying up late the night before a big test to cram never really works out. It's the same case for Yu-Gi-Oh events, so it's not worth staying up late to playtest, and I'd recommend making sure you get sufficient amounts of sleep instead to ensure that you're able to play your best at a long tournament. Finally, I'll be covering some actual gameplay tips in tournaments themselves, starting off with having a strong mental game. It's super important to remember that Yu-Gi-Oh is a game where losing is inevitable, whether it's to your own mistakes, to poor luck, or simply being outplayed by an opponent. Even the best players in the game aren't able to always win every tournament they attend, and as such, I'd suggest not beating yourself up over any losses you take and move on. For every game you lose because of your own silly mistake, there'll be another game in the future you'll win because your opponent made a similarly careless mistake. You'll experience both good and bad luck all the time, so it's really important to be able to quickly move on after you take a loss. In short, try not to let the results of each individual game affect how you would play in the next game. My next tip would be to pay attention when you're playing a match in person.
You can't be like all loosey-goosey, having a sandwich, being on your phone.
In all seriousness though, you can gain a lot of valuable information just by observing your opponent before and during the match. As a very quick example, a lot of sighing and a general slowdown in the pace of your opponent's play usually indicates a weak hand on their end. A vast majority of the time, your opponents also aren't going out of their way to try to give you a quote-unquote false tell to throw you off either. So the observations you make about your opponents will allow you to gain valuable information. However, this goes both ways as well. While you may want to express your displeasure about your bad hand or that you're trying out a new card in your deck in a competitive setting, these things give your opponent additional information that they otherwise shouldn't have. So in short, pay attention to how your opponent acts during the match and make sure that you aren't giving away unnecessary information to them. Finally, and perhaps the most important tip I have, is to remember that at the end of the day, Yu-Gi-Oh is just a game. While it's certainly nice to win, it's not worth ruining your mood over. After all, Yu-Gi-Oh's prizing isn't really anything exceptional, at least when compared to other card games, and you can save yourself a lot of unnecessary stress by remembering that you're just playing the game to have fun and not to make a living. So that's going to do it for the complete guide to competitive Yu-Gi-Oh in 2024. If you found this video helpful, then please let me know by subscribing to the channel. I put a lot more efforts into these videos, so if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you showed your support by simply subscribing. If you think that I missed anything important, then let me know in the comment section below. But also remember that the game's rules may change from time to time, so just be sure that you're kept up with whatever the most recent changes to the rules are at the time you're watching this video. Now before ending off this video, I just want to give a shout out to YourPlaymat, which allows you to create custom sleeves and playmats with your unique design on them. This is perfect for any competitive player, and if this sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to use my affiliate link in the description below or use code SAM10YP at checkout to get 10% off your entire order while also helping to support the channel. With all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and best of luck with your competitive journey this year.